The day my narcissist boss fired me for being too sick to work, he had no idea I'd been quietly collecting evidence for months. Evidence that could destroy him, and the company he thought would protect him forever. If you've ever dreamed of seeing a workplace bully finally get what's coming, hit that subscribe button. Like this video, and stick around, because in this story, justice isn't just served, it's delivered with interest. I wasn't looking for another corporate war. After 10 exhausting years in the tech industry, 10 years of making fortunes for men in expensive suits who barely remembered my name, I had finally stepped off the treadmill. I spent months traveling, fixing up my little house, and learning how to wake up without an alarm clock. For the first time in years, I could breathe. Then one afternoon over lunch, my best friend Mia leaned across the table and said, "Clara, you've had your vacation. Time to get back out there." She just started working at a big construction firm and told me there was an opening in her department. I had zero experience in construction, but the idea of doing something totally new appealed to me. I sent in my resume, studied everything I could find about the role, and somehow faked my way through the interviews. A week later, I was in. From day one, the job was unlike anything I'd done before, physically draining, mentally taxing, and filled with an unspoken hierarchy I didn't yet understand. And at the top of that hierarchy was Gerald Pike. He was the kind of man who thought a gold watch and a company plaque made him a king. Everyone knew he'd been with the company since it was founded, and he acted like that gave him the right to rule without question. He was part of what Mia called the Old Boys Club, a group of senior managers who protected each other no matter what. Gerald's reputation preceded him. He was sexist, manipulative, and allergic to the very idea of HR oversight. Most of his cruelty was aimed at others, especially women, and Mia often bore the brunt of it. I'd watch him belittle her in meetings, roll his eyes when she spoke, even take credit for her work. Every time I saw it, my stomach tightened. I tried to stay out of his line of fire, but the tension in the office was like a constant hum in my ears. 3 months in, the pressure began to bleed into my personal life. On New Year's Day, I woke up at 2 a.m. with crushing chest pain and a head spinning so fast I could barely stand. My roommate, a paramedic, checked my vitals and told me I was probably having a panic attack. I'd never had one before. Over the next week, the chest pain and heart palpitations returned again and again, until my doctor diagnosed acid reflux and sent me home with medication. For a few days, I felt better. Then, one rainy evening after dinner with my sister, I was stopped at a red light when a drunk driver slammed into the back of my car. The force shoved me forward so hard my seatbelt locked against my ribs. At the ER, my blood pressure was sky high, and the tightness in my chest returned with a vengeance. More tests. More specialists. More time away from work. That's when Gerald turned on me. Every missed day became a personal affront. He'd mutter about my lack of commitment in front of the team, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I tried to keep up, even taking on extra projects where I could use my old tech skills, creating detailed reports, analyzing cost data, finding ways to save the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. But every time I handed Gerald one of my reports, he'd strip my name off and present it as his own to upper management. The theft didn't even seem to bother him, he acted like it was his birthright. My health kept spiraling. Test after test came back clean. No heart disease. No chronic illness. Just stress-induced anxiety, my doctor said. He referred me to a counselor who gave me tools to manage it. But walking into that office each day was like stepping back into the ring with a heavyweight fighter who wanted to break me. I started emailing HR about Gerald, documenting his treatment of me and of others. Each email felt like shouting into a void. HR's responses were polite but hollow, the corporate equivalent of thoughts and prayers. Mia and I both knew why. Gerald was untouchable. Or at least, that's what he thought. What I didn't know then was that the stress, the insults, and the stolen work were laying the groundwork for something I would one day use against him. Every sarcastic jab, every public humiliation, every petty retaliation, it was all becoming evidence. I just hadn't realized yet that I was building my case. And Gerald had no idea he was giving me the weapons I'd one day use to take him down. The breaking point didn't come with a big blowout. It came quietly, almost politely, like a knife sliding between my ribs. It started when Lisa, one of our most respected coworkers, handed in her resignation. Lisa wasn't just good at her job, she was the kind of person everyone in the department leaned on. If something was broken, she fixed it. If someone was drowning in work, she jumped in without hesitation. So when she announced she was leaving, the whole office went still. Her reason? Gerald. She didn't sugarcoat it, either. In her exit interview, she laid out exactly how his temper, his favoritism, and his constant undermining had driven her out. Word of her blunt honesty spread fast, and soon even the upper floors were buzzing. For the first time, it seemed like Gerald's armor might have a crack in it. HR called a departmental meeting. "This is your chance," Mia whispered as we filed into the conference room. "If enough of us speak up, they'll have to do something." I came prepared. I had slides, charts, specific dates and times of incidents. I spoke calmly but firmly, outlining how Gerald's behavior wasn't just toxic, it was costing the company money, burning through good employees like fire through dry grass. Mia and others shared their own stories. You could feel the tension in the air, the collective hope that this was finally the moment we'd be heard. But as soon as the meeting ended, I knew something was wrong. Gerald leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't the look of a man who'd been chastened. It was the look of a man taking mental notes. Later, I'd learned that the whole thing was a charade. A box checked. HR's official report recommended management counseling for Gerald, which I'm certain he never attended. And instead of changing, he doubled down. The yelling grew louder. The write-ups appeared out of nowhere, petty, vague accusations of poor attitude or failing to meet expectations. I knew I had to protect myself. So I started recording. Every meeting. Every hallway conversation. I backed up every email and stored them on a private drive. I wrote detailed logs of each interaction, complete with timestamps. It felt paranoid at first, but with each passing week, it became clear I was in a war, and this was my ammunition. The final straw came months later, after a nasty head cold knocked me out for a few days. My sick leave was protected by state law, and I'd followed every procedure, called in, logged the time, provided documentation. I thought nothing of it when I returned. A week later, Gerald summoned me to his office. Senior management was there, sitting stiffly like actors in a bad play. Gerald cleared his throat and delivered the line he'd been rehearsing. "Clara, we've decided to terminate your employment due to excessive absences." I stared at him, stunned. Excessive absences? I've used legally protected sick time. "It's still attendance," he said, his tone smug. "We need people we can count on." The rest of the meeting was a blur. They offered me 2 weeks severance if I signed a release waiving all claims against the company. My hands shook as I slid the paper back across the desk. "No," I said simply. Then I walked out. At first, I felt crushed. I'd never been fired before. It was humiliating, infuriating. But the feeling didn't last. Because deep down, beneath the shock and anger, something else was taking root, a sharp, electric clarity. I had the emails. The recordings. The logs. And a mother who had spent her life in the legal field. Gerald thought he'd won. But he had just handed me the opening I needed to dismantle him, and maybe, just maybe, take a piece of the company down with him. The morning after I was fired, I woke up in that strange fog of disbelief, where your brain keeps trying to rewrite what happened. Surely it had been a bad dream. Surely I still had a job. Then my eyes landed on the cardboard box of office junk I'd dumped on the kitchen table, and the reality hit again, sharp and cold. I made coffee, sat down, and opened my laptop. The first email I typed wasn't to Mia, or to my family. It was to my mother. She'd spent 3 decades in the legal field, and while she wasn't a lawyer herself, she knew the landscape better than most attorneys I'd met. I told her what happened, and by the time I finished my story, her reply was already in my inbox. *I have someone you need to talk to. Do not sign anything. Gather every single piece of evidence you have. *. I didn't need to be told twice. For the next 2 days, I became an archivist of my own misery. I organized the recordings, naming each file by date and subject. I printed out emails and highlighted the key lines, the sexist remarks, the retaliatory write-ups, the stolen project reports. I assembled a timeline of my health issues, backed by doctor's notes, HR notifications, and sick leave requests. By the time I was done, the stack of paper was almost 3 inches thick. The appointment with the employment lawyer couldn't come soon enough. When I finally walked into his office, he greeted me with a firm handshake and a neutral expression. I set the box of evidence on his desk, and his brows lifted slightly. "That's a lot," he said. "It's everything," I told him. We started at the beginning. I told him about the panic attacks, the accident, the medical leave. I detailed Gerald's retaliation after the so-called HR intervention, the fake counseling, the escalating hostility. I played him one of the recordings, Gerald berating Mia in front of the team, dismissing her concerns with a sneer. By the time I finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Clara," he said slowly, "you have a hell of a case here. They messed up badly. And I'm not just talking about the sick time. I'd assumed that firing me for using protected sick leave was my only solid angle. But as he walked me through each violation, my understanding shifted. The HR meeting where we confronted Gerald? That was protected concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Act. Retaliating against me afterward was illegal. Their failure to make accommodations for my anxiety after I'd disclosed it? That was a potential violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the gender-based treatment I'd documented? That could trigger a Civil Rights Act investigation. Each point he made was like a flare going up in the dark, illuminating just how much power I was holding. My humiliation was turning into something else, something sharper. "You've got 3 options," he said finally. 1. We file a lawsuit. It'll take years, but you'd probably get a substantial payout. 2. We file complaints with the relevant agencies. Some will drag their feet, but others, especially the NLRB, can make life hell for your employer. Or 3, you take this and renegotiate your severance. Quick, clean, and still painful for them. I sat back, weighing the options. I didn't want to be tied to this company for years in a legal battle, but I also wanted Gerald to feel it. The idea of sitting across from HR, watching their faces when I laid out exactly what I had, made my pulse quicken. The lawyer smiled like he'd read my mind. "If you go with option 3, start high. Ask for 9 months severance and full benefits. You've got the leverage." They know a public fight would look bad for them. When I left his office, the city air felt different, crisp, alive. I wasn't just a woman who'd been fired anymore. I was a woman with an arsenal, and my former boss had no idea he was already standing in my sights. Gerald thought the meeting where he fired me was the end of the story. He didn't know it was just the prologue. 2 weeks after my meeting with the lawyer, I walked into the company's glass-walled conference room like I owned the place. It was the same room where Gerald had humiliated so many people, where I had watched careers wither under his smirk. Today, the balance of power felt different. HR manager Diane sat at one end of the table, her face arranged in a polite mask. Beside her was the company's in-house counsel, a tall man in a navy suit whose eyes flicked between his notes and me like he was scanning for weaknesses. Gerald wasn't there. That disappointed me a little. I'd been ready to watch his expression crack. But this meeting wasn't about him seeing me win, it was about making the whole structure that had protected him feel my presence. "Clara," Diane began with a tight smile, "thank you for coming in to discuss this matter further." I set my folder on the table. Before we start, I said, you should know I consulted an employment attorney. He's identified multiple serious violations, federal ones, that occurred during my employment here. I've documented everything. I watched the lawyer's pen freeze in midair. Diane's smile faltered. I'm willing to settle this quickly, I continued, but I'm not signing away my rights for 2 weeks severance. I'm asking for 9 months of pay and full benefits. Silence. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint ticking of Diane's wristwatch. That's a substantial demand, the lawyer said at last. So are violations of the National Labor Relations Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Civil Rights Act, I replied, sliding a neatly labeled binder across the table. This contains emails, recordings, and timelines of events. If you'd like, I can also forward copies to the relevant federal agencies. That got their attention. The lawyer opened the binder and scanned a page, his eyes narrowing. Diane's fingers twisted in her lap. We'll need time to review this, the lawyer said, already sounding less certain. Of course, I said, leaning back. But understand, if we can't reach an agreement, I'm prepared to escalate immediately. I'd prefer to avoid that. This can be a clean break for all of us. We met twice more over the next 2 weeks. The first follow-up was all posturing, they countered with 3 months, no benefits. I declined. The second meeting was quieter, almost tense. They knew I wasn't bluffing. I didn't flinch when they tried to paint it as generous or warn me about reputation risks. I'd already been fired. My reputation wasn't the one on the line. Finally, on a rainy Thursday morning, Diane called. We're prepared to offer 6 months severance with full benefits. That's our final number. I let the silence stretch for just a beat too long. Put it in writing, I said. When I hung up, I didn't whoop or cry. Instead, I felt this steady, deep satisfaction settle in my chest. Not joy exactly, something heavier, richer. For months, Gerald had chipped away at my dignity, my health, my sense of safety. Today, I'd taken back every piece of it. Word of the settlement spread quietly through my old department. Mia texted me a single line, "You're a legend." I learned later that Gerald had been reassigned to a non-management role, stripped of the authority he'd abused for years. That part wasn't in my settlement, but I can't say it didn't feel like the cherry on top. The old boys club had tried to close the door on me. Instead, I'd walked out on my own terms, with months of security in my pocket and the knowledge that their untouchable king had been knocked off his throne. And somewhere, in a locked drawer in my house, the binder still sat, every email, every recording, every piece of proof. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it was a reminder, sometimes the best revenge isn't burning it all down. It's letting them know you could. 6 months of severance and full benefits meant more than just financial breathing room, it was time bought back. Time to rest. Time to heal. Time to remember who I was before Gerald's shadow crept into my life. At first, the quiet felt unnatural. For months, I'd woken up with a knot in my stomach, bracing for the next blow, another email dripping with sarcasm, another meeting where my ideas would be stolen, another hallway ambush of muttered insults. Now, mornings began with coffee by my kitchen window, the sunlight spilling across the table. The constant hum of tension in my chest slowly faded into stillness. Mia and I stayed in touch, and every so often she'd slip me updates. Gerald wasn't handling his demotion well. The role they moved him into had no direct reports, no control over budgets or projects. The man who had once strutted through the office like a general now spent his days in a small, windowless office, shuffling paperwork. He hates it, Mia said once, and I could hear the smile in her voice. It wasn't about revenge in the cartoonish sense. I didn't want to see him lose his house or be humiliated in the streets. It was about balance. He had spent years tipping the scales in his favor, crushing anyone who got in his way. Now, the scales had shifted back. That was enough. I used the severance cushion to be selective about my next job. I wanted a place where talent mattered more than politics, where leadership was about building people up instead of breaking them down. After weeks of interviews, I landed a role at another construction firm, this one smaller, tighter-knit, and run by people who actually listened. On my first day, my new boss thanked me for my ideas in front of the team. I almost didn't know how to respond. One evening, months later, I opened the drawer where I'd kept the binder. My fingers ran over the labeled tabs, emails, recordings, medical documentation. It wasn't anger that washed over me this time, but pride. Pride in the woman who refused to be cornered. Pride in the woman who walked away, not empty-handed, but with the proof that her voice mattered. Sometimes, I think about the moment in Gerald's office when he told me I was done. How sure he looked. How final it seemed. And then I think about the conference room weeks later, the shift in the air when they realized I was not their victim but their opponent. I learned something in all this: power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet confidence of knowing the truth is on your side. Sometimes, it's walking away without looking back because you've already won. Gerald may never understand how much damage he caused. He may never apologize, never admit fault. But every time he walks into that small, windowless office, I hope he feels the edges of the throne he lost, and remembers the woman who pulled it out from under him. And me? I've got my peace, my health, and a future that's entirely mine. That's the kind of victory no one can take away.